Welcome everyone to today's HI seminar, Owning Ethics, Organizational Responsibility, and the Institutionalization of Ethics in Silicon Valley. As a reminder, after our two speakers conclude their presentation, you can go to the HI event website and click on the link that says Join the Conversation to submit questions to them that will be addressed during the closing Q&A session. Today's speakers come from the Data and Society Research Institute in New York City. If after the talk you'd like to learn more about their project, visit Data and Society's website for their full article published in the journal Social Research, and it shares the same title as today's talk. To introduce our two speakers, Emmanuel Moss is a researcher for the AI on the Ground initiative at Data and Society and a research assistant on the Pervasive Data Ethics for Computational Research, or PERVADE project. He's also a doctoral candidate in cultural anthropology at the CUNY Graduate Center, where he's studying machine learning from an ethnographic perspective and the role of data scientists as producers of knowledge. He's particularly interested in how data science, machine learning, and artificial intelligence are shaped by organizational, economic, and ethical prerogatives. Dr. Jacob Metcalf is a researcher at Data and Society, where he's a member of the AI on the Ground initiative as well, and works on an NSF-funded, multi-sided project, which is also the PERVADE project, Pervasive Data Ethics for Computational Research. For this project, he studies how data ethics practices are emerging in environments that have not previously grappled with research ethics, such as industry, IRBs, and civil society organizations. His recent work has focused on the new organizational roles that have developed around AI ethics in tech companies. Jake's consulting firm, Ethical Resolve, provides a range of ethics services, helping clients to make well-informed, consistent, actionable, and timely business decisions that reflect their values. Jake also serves as the ethics subgroup chair for the IEEE P7000 standard. Emmanuel and Jacob, I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you so much for having us. We're really happy to be here. Even though we're gathering today on the internet, we as presenters are currently standing on the unceded lands of the Muwekma Ohlone, Canarsie, and Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging these communities and those where you sit, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. We acknowledge our institutions have been founded upon exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those on whose land we stand today. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. So thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Today we are going to talk about our research project on owning ethics, organizational responsibility, and the institutionalization of ethics in Silicon Valley. I'm going to speak, and then Jake's going to speak, and then I'm going to speak again. And then we'll have time for questions, hopefully. So this work builds upon an academic article that came out in Social Research last year, and which we've expanded upon for a Data and Society report coming out this June. We've also done some additional thinking and analysis in an associated Harvard Business Review piece and in a Data and Society Points blog post that came out this week, and I'd encourage you to give those a look if you're so inclined. Our research begins with a well-rehearsed series of scandals, controversies, or crises, which played out in popular media that began to make visible the stakes of Silicon Valley companies and data-driven technologies for all of society. This series includes Google's Project Maven, which called into question the right of engineers to know what they're building and make a choice about what they're contributing to, even if it is for something that some might see as being as noble as national security. While Maven's a project for the government of the country where Google is headquartered, these questions are differently inflected when the client is the government of China, as with Google's Project Dragonfly, a censored search engine for use on mainland China. This period of scandals also saw Cambridge Analytica, which foregrounded how platforms and data practices can be manipulated to undermine democratic governance. It also saw the 2016 publishing by ProPublica of a story titled Machine Bias that documented the racial disparities in algorithms used in criminal justice settings, calling to attention the issue of algorithms that replicate or magnify existing social biases in code with dramatic consequences for people. This period also saw in 2018 employees of Google staging a walkout in protest of the failure of the company to adequately address sexual harassment there, highlighting both the organizing power of workers and their advocacy. We see this today on May Day when many workers who are not always considered tech workers, but who are integral to the work of tech are on strike. So we want to take a moment to acknowledge their work the fight for fair compensation, and the fight for adequate worker protections. This period also saw an increasing prevalence in the use of facial recognition technologies and their implications for privacy, autonomy, anonymity, freedom of assembly, freedom of free movement, and due process. These questions around surveillance are only heightened in the current moment of pandemic, when the upside benefits and downside risks of such technologies are being rapidly rebalanced as various institutions contend with the power of such technologies over people. So, although all these stories get grouped as being about ethics, organizationally, they're quite distinct and invoke different parts of corporate organizations. So calling this amorphous group ethics scandals actually misses the heterogeneity, the multiple meanings of what we talk about when we talk about ethics. For our research, we started from the premise that there were already people inside the tech industry who were aware of the depth and extent of these kinds of problems that the industry was facing, and were actively trying to fix those problems beyond and beneath the level of the more public controversies that were swirling at the time. So we wound up finding or being pointed to people in all sorts of roles that had an overlapping set of responsibilities that could broadly be construed as pertaining to ethics inside the tech industry. These folks had titles like Responsible AI Lead, Ethical AI Practice Lead, Head of AI for Good, Civil Liberties Lead, as well as ethical AI researchers inside of corporate research teams and heads of policy, product, and legal teams at a large number of tech companies with headquarters in Silicon Valley. In addition to the interviews with folks in these kinds of roles, we also interviewed employees who had been active around some of the issues I just mentioned, and interviewed people working in advocacy organizations on these issues. We also attended a number of ethics-related events and convenings across the Bay Area, from public meetups on AI or tech ethics to data ethics salons being held under Chatham House rules, hosted at a rotating series of corporate headquarters. These salons would bring together people with responsibilities over ethics inside their company, along with academics and other researchers, including Jake and I, practicing ethicists, and occasionally management consultants. In talking to all these folks about how they understand their responsibilities, how they see the problems the industry is facing, what their work consists of on a daily, weekly, and yearly basis, and how they're positioned structurally within their organizations, we came to see all those people as an emergent set of actors within the tech industry, which we call ethics owners. They own responsibility for ethics practices across an organization and manage a portfolio of concerns that is oriented on transforming principles, values, ethical stances, and often legal and regulatory imperatives into concrete practices within their organization. What we found was that despite the fact that these folks are aware of the problems in their industry and are trying to do the right thing, they work within a set of seemingly inescapable logics. Meritocracy, technological solutionism, and market fundamentalism are three of those logics that we identified. Meritocracy, an ideology that rationalizes inequality by linking the unequal distribution of wealth and power to natural differences in individuals' ability, is pervasive in Silicon Valley, as it is across the Western world, and props up much of Silicon Valley's economic power and cultural cachet. Tech companies brag about hiring the best people from top schools, and meritocratic thinking can result in a misplaced confidence that a company's employees can succeed at any challenge. We often heard from ethics owners that much of their own work is premised on the idea that everyone in the company is good and trying to do the right thing. And so ethics owners try to make space for technical teams to get together in a room to think really hard about the potential ethical implications of a product. It's one thing to ask such a team to think of all the potential engineering problems that might arise from a design decision, but it's another thing altogether to ask engineers to think of how a design decision might affect the lives of those whose experience and social position are drastically different from that of most Silicon Valley technologists. Technological solutionism. While most of our interviewees acknowledge that there may be no silver bullet for ethical problems, the search for technological solutions that use, quote, the superpowers given to you by tech, as one lead researcher put it, is strongly foregrounded in interviews and public discourse. Stated desires for toolkits and checklists posit that a technological solution is possible, even if it is yet to be fully developed. In some accounts, this gives the impression that ethics problems arise from imperfect technical solutions. Describing ethics problems as best practice problems centers ethics in the practices of technologists and not in the social worlds they develop technical systems for and within. Many of the most intractable social impacts of technology arise from products that work exactly as intended, which stands in stark contrast to the well-intentioned search for best practices, procedures, checklists, concrete metrics that can guarantee an ethical outcome. But best practices are well suited to technologists' work, to systems that can be accurately modeled in a development environment, not the social worlds in which their products are expected to function responsibly and ethically. Market fundamentalism refers to the idea that the market can decide which ideas are good and which are bad, an idea that has been applied far beyond the domain of economic markets. Unless ethical risk can be priced into the product development process, it remains very difficult for ethics owners to argue for organizational interventions that add friction to that process. Assumptions about the need to satisfy market demands also help explain why companies tend not to invest in ethics practices until they are fairly large or well capitalized. Interestingly, we didn't hear from ethics owners that they could never take actions that reduced revenue. What we heard instead was that their initiatives need to be couched in the language and concepts of the market. The market logic was not just or simply a demand for profit maximization or shareholder value. It was a logic that set the terms of the discussion and the parameters of success. As tech companies start to envision procedures to operationalize ethics, they do so according to their own internal logics, which produces a couple of pitfalls for ethics owners. One approach that fits squarely within these logics is that of legal or business risk accounting. Risk accounting describes risk and determines its acceptable levels, defining the situation in ways that let ethics owners manage potential consequences within a range of acceptable costs to the firm. These practices resemble what Diane Vaughan in 1996 identified as the normalization of deviance. Vaughan concludes of the Challenger space shuttle disaster that the horrific outcome was actually a byproduct of organizational actors responsibly and rationally developing, standardizing, and implementing risk procedures that over time produce significant vulnerabilities. Without addressing the underlying logics to responsibly structure an organization to identify and guard against ethical failure, the mere implementation of ethical procedures may backfire, even when those processes were implemented to prevent that outcome. As tech companies begin to implement ethics practices across their organizations, there's pressure to share best practices. Seeing the world of their work through the same set of logics means folks are likely to try the same inadequate approaches and aren't learning from each other's failures. Collectively, with an eye towards avoiding risk, companies tend to steer their decision-making to respond to and ideally avoid public calamities. They're far less likely to share or learn from others' actions, particularly about issues that were never publicized. In this process, they create a form of blinkered isomorphism. Like a pony wearing blinkers, tech companies reproduce the same ethical blind spots across the entire industry. At best, they see their own problems, but everyone else's solutions. I'm going to turn it over to Jake Metcalf now to talk about the development of ethics practices inside the industry.
Thanks, Manny. And thank you everyone for joining us. We found that ethics owners often invoked sort of precursor ethics frameworks. So using familiar language, extant concepts from already familiar forms of applied ethics, we often saw an invocation of tools that already exist, but also push and pull around the utility for their specific situation. And this is part of what signaled to us that something new or different is happening in this context. So first we saw, Manny, next slide. We saw a lot of conversation around research ethics, particularly IRBs. So, there's a long history of scandal behind the creation of IRBs in the mid 20th century, or rather the creation of research ethics regulations in the late 20th century. Comes largely from scandals in the mid 20th century. And so there's a lot of narrative around, cruel researchers or even Nazis, Nazi doctors in the Nuremberg trial that would often feel inappropriate or an ill-suited fit for the conversations that were happening around tech ethics. Yet we often heard the results of that history invoked as a possible model for companies to adopt, especially around IRBs. So it was very common for us to hear institutional review boards invoked as either a model or a foil for companies to adopt. And the language around that was that companies thought that IRBs would be cumbersome. They would be slow in a way that many academic researchers complain about the IRBs they have to encounter. On the other hand, IRBs are familiar. It is the language and tools that the research scientists that the companies are hiring, who have often have PhDs or at least MAs, if they were involved in a social science or psychology or economics department, then they may have actually already encountered IRBs and are familiar with that language and those structures. And so there was a push and pull between thinking that there was an advantage to modeling their ethics review practices around IRBs because they are both familiar, but then also all the downsides are familiar too. We found that importantly, IRBs actually exist to solve a different problem than what the ethics owners have. And that is around protecting research subjects from the harms that are caused by the research. The problems that ethics owners were often grappling with were about not about research harms, but rather about dispersed and community harms that needed to address populations or address harms to society. And IRBs are specifically built to not consider those kinds of questions. Next slide. We saw a lot of, although we rarely heard the term business ethics, we heard many of the concepts and debates in business ethics literature invoked, particularly around who should business operations consider as the sort of ethical subject of their decisions. And that's often expressed in terms of whether the business decisions need to provide value to shareholders or stakeholders, right? So that's a long-running debate around business ethics and economics. One ethics owner told us it's really about, quote, it's really about metrics going back to how much value are we adding to our stock and to the stockholder. And stockholder value isn't based on what we're doing that's positive in the world, despite whatever values or mottos the individual companies may have, end quote. And what we see there is an attempt in conversations about ethics, which is about harm to users or communities, is a weighting of how will our actions and our decisions about the well-being of our users interact with our stock value. And then it's often read through some complicated internal metrics such as clicks, right? Everything goes back to clicks for a lot of software companies. And so there's within these long-running business ethics debates, the ethics owners are dealing with these sort of intermediary concepts and measures. Next slide, Manny. We heard a lot of discussion around professional ethics. So you may be, within the last few years, there's been a lot of conversation around the need for something like, quote, Hippocratic oath for data science. And there have been several attempts, which were well-meaning. There's also a lot of existing professional ethics standards, such as from the ACM or AOIR or IEEE. There's also the Menlo report, which was inspired by the Belmont report that drove the creation of IRBs. What's important to note about these codes of ethics is that they speak to obligations of professionals as individuals. They lay out what practitioners of a set of technical skills ought to do and ought not to do in order to be considered responsible members of that profession. That's a long-standing feature of trade organizations. But what such codes of ethics do not do is offer guidance on how to resolve the concerns of ethics owners or the business itself. which those are fundamentally about how to understand the effects of technology products as they're integrated with society at scale, or how to track and measure potential impacts of those products and how to ameliorate harm. Codes of ethics speak to the decisions of individuals as professionals who may be employed by several different organizations. And so ethics owners, as folks trying to integrate organizational practices in order to speak to ethics problems, didn't really find professional ethics codes all that useful for addressing their day-to-day concerns. Next slide. Oh, thanks. We also heard conversations around organizational practices as a kind of conceptual precursor to the work of ethics owners. Ethics owners draw upon these existing practices for organizational ethics from other domains. They also draw on existing ways of organizing work within Silicon Valley. So we saw a lot of attempts to import common cultural practices of Silicon Valley into ethics conversations, such as the ubiquitous sticky note board. I can't tell you how many times I saw the same sticky notes up on boards. So ethics owners are trying to routinize behaviors around ethical issues inside their companies using some of those same tools and processes that have already been routinized to organize work across the company. And so in some ways, even though these are new questions, the organizational practices are familiar and somewhat mundane. And so ethics owners would look to connect corporate statements of principle with codes of ethics, to utilize ethics review boards for catching and addressing ethically risky projects. They would utilize the software development lifecycle tools for tracking matters of ethical concern across design and development workflows and calendars. They would draw on approaches that have been developed to address privacy and security settings, like red teams or abuse ability attesting, checklists for reducing blind spots. They're also interested in building ethics into common organizational features around employee performance, such as OKRs, objective key results, and KPIs, or key performance indicators. We heard many times that if we can measure it, we can fix it, but crafting OKRs and KPIs that speak to ethical concerns remains to be a significant challenge among the ethics owners we've spoken to, in part because companies treat these measures as closely guarded secrets. Next slide, Manny. Thank you. Because of the unique challenges ethics owners face, the tools they have at their disposal, and the underlying assumptions about how work in Silicon Valley ought to be conducted, they face a set of fundamentally unresolvable tensions that have to nevertheless be navigated in their day-to-day work. So these tensions that we identified sit at the intersection of different contradictory descriptions of the work done inside tech companies. And so as translators, ethics owners straddle these tensions without ever fundamentally resolving them. The specific context in which ethics problems exist means that no single generalizable solution will fit all use cases. In fact, the core feature of the ethics owner role that we identified is that working through these tensions is never resolved, but rather the work is to deal with the tensions in a day-to-day manner. Next slide. First tension we identified is between personal ethics and corporate duties. As employees, ethics owners always have both personal ethical commitments and corporate duties, which they often found in conflict. This ethics owner that we're quoting here worked for a company that they actually found rather copacetic with their personal values, in part because that company's very public commitment to a specific set of values around free speech drew in or helped recruit their engineering talent. So sometimes when companies have business models that specifically invoke a concrete set of values, that ends up being a way of identifying the engineering and data science talent that they actually can have access to. Next slide. We saw a tension between upside benefits and downside risks. Ethics owners find that it's far easier to advocate for changes that limit potentially harmful effects of a product than it is to advocate for changes that may prove beneficial for users. This isn't because there aren't upsides, right? We heard a lot of discussion of how to articulate those upsides, a lot of assumption that those upsides exist, that we found at least plausible. But it's because the common business metrics that are available to ethics owners to articulate their case to their employer made downside risks much more legible, right? So in part because ethics owners would often sit between policy and legal teams, those teams are more oriented towards blunting downside risk. When ethics owners sat closer to technical teams, well, those teams tend to be more oriented towards capturing upside risk through product development, or sorry, upside benefits through product development. Also, upsides tend to be longer term and they're often counterfactual. So it's harder to demonstrate the benefit of something you did as opposed to something you didn't do. And so it's not even necessarily, even if it is not necessarily more profitable over time, that short-term reasoning is certainly easier to articulate as a business model that externalizes future downsides and pockets current upsides. Next slide. One of the interesting tensions we identified that maybe should have been obvious up front, but really only came through conversing with ethics owners from companies with a very wide variety of business models, is that the business model dictates what type of investments a company finds valuable around ethics capacity. For ethics owners, how they approach their work is deeply affected by their employer's business model, and standard practices might not work across different business models, even if we might clump those companies into something called the tech industry. In particular, we saw a conflict between B2C or business to consumer versus B2B or business to business investments. So B2C businesses, service providers that directly enlist users from the public, like a Facebook or a Twitter, get a lot of negative attention because the public has direct access to those products, especially notably academics and journalists who use those platforms. But we actually saw perhaps the largest investment in ethics owners in similar capacity in B2B companies, and that's because it's much easier to articulate a business upside, because having trust and ethics at the forefront of a business case smooths the business relationship with the other company. In B2B2C companies like cloud platforms, there's the additional problem of not knowing actually who the end user is. And that makes it harder to articulate what kinds of harms might be possible. Next slide. We saw a tension around measurable and non-measurable impacts. Developing metrics for the ethical impacts of tech products and tracking the success of interventions remains one of the greatest challenges for ethics owners. That's in part because tech companies are so strongly oriented toward metrics in all decisions. But it's important to note that this quote here, if we can measure it, we can fix it, doesn't necessarily imply the inverse, that if you can't measure it, you can't fix it. There are opportunities for capturing non-measurable harms as solvable problems. There's also some mundane and familiar forms of metrics that are available to ethics owners, like OKRs and KPIs. Also questions about how many products have received a review, how many engineers fill out the product requirement documents on time, how many products meet defined fairness metrics, scores on ethics training modules, where like a familiar form of measurement then provides them with a new form of leverage. Next slide. We saw a tension between users and non-users. Of course, tech companies know their users pretty well, but they also only know their users in terms of the data that they collect about those users, right? So there are often blind spots about the users' lives that are relevant to ethical decision making, but which the companies don't have access to, right? Or where getting access to that data might be undesirable. It would have PR problems, or might even be illegal. So, should a gig company collect, a gig economy service company collect racial information of other customers? In some cases, that might actually be illegal, even though having that data would help resolve questions about algorithmic bias or fairness. And then not knowing anything about the users, not knowing anything about non-users poses other kinds of problems, particularly when trying to capture community or societal consequences. Next slide. We saw a tension between specificity and generalizability that was largely driven by scaling. So like the rest of Silicon Valley, ethics owners face significant challenges when attempting to scale their methods across contexts. Machine learning and AI economies are about accelerating scale rapidly, but often ethics questions are highly contextual and specific. And so there's a push and a pull around what we can know with specificity and what we can know generalizably. And I'm going to hand it back to Manny.
Great, thanks, Jake. So what I hope we've been able to show is that ethics owners are really a kind of node in a flat organization, usually. So a lot of their work serves a coordinating function. Their job isn't so much to make the company ethical, but to make the ethics of the company work in many different ways. This indicates that they can have the most influence disseminating ideas across the company and across their peer network of other ethics owners in the industry. We see ethics owners then as ideally positioned to take several steps that leverage this position in ways that minimize the pitfalls that organizational ethics are prone to in the tech industry, which can be complemented by doing so through a reflective awareness of how the dominant logics of the industry produce those limitations. So ethics owners need a robust body of case studies that generalize knowledge between companies, even if it needs to be deployed in specific contexts. Ethics owners can actively produce case studies from their own domains and commission case studies from affected populations that not only capture what did and did not work in the past, but can help create real lines of communication between ethics owners in different companies and fields, as well as between themselves and affected communities. Case studies should not be generic, rather they should highlight particular, unique, idiosyncratic details that reveal the intricacies involved in both successful and unsuccessful projects. Ethics owners working across the industry have already created spaces where informal sharing of practices under the cover of semi-secrecy has been possible. We attended many of these spaces as part of our fieldwork. These spaces can serve as a model for the trust needed to collect the kinds of case studies that can improve ethical practices across the industry. A recurring series of informal meetings operating under something like Chatham House rules that allow for employees to discuss issues frankly without having to have their marks pre-cleared by a press department are one model for sharing the broad base of knowledge ethics owners draw upon in their work at the requisite level of detail. Citizen advocates, activists, and users are closest to the societal impact of technology and ought to be the closest to any solution. This is particularly true for understanding and addressing the racial and gendered impacts of technologies. As Jesse Daniels, Natalia Nkonde, and Darakshan Mir point out in their 2019 piece, Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech, quote, any turn towards ethics is an important one. It is incomplete without a racial lens, end quote. While already ongoing conversations about ethics and race in technology have focused on pipeline issues, diversity and inclusion initiatives, and implicit bias training, ethics owners have the opportunity to extend these increasingly common set of moves beyond what is quickly becoming the industry standard. developing ways of listening to and responsibly engaging with the concerns of those affected or potentially affected, particularly in historically disadvantaged groups, is crucial to any ethics practice that centers care and dignity over more narrow, quantified framings of risk and liability. So we've set out how we've understood the world in which ethics owners work, some of the logics that shape their understanding of the world, the pitfalls that produces, the tensions that they must work through, and a couple of opportunities we see for their work. And so we'd be very happy, with thanks to our sponsors, to continue the conversation with you all now. The link at the bottom is the Slido, and I'm gonna stop talking for a second.
Thank you both so much for sharing your incredible work. There's so much we can go into, and I've already got questions teed up. And you can both answer or designate one of you to answer, whatever you're comfortable with. So one question is, what is the lingering impact, if any, of Google's dismissing or dissolving its ethics board in April of last year?
That's a really interesting question. We hear a lot of conversation about ethics boards from ethics owners, but the issue with boards is they're meant to be advisory. They're not meant to be there on a day-to-day basis, and they're removed both, like, in spatially and temporally from the day-to-day practices that ethics owners are really focused on, which is how many engineers are filling out the product requirement documents correctly, right? And the advisory boards or ethics boards are especially useful for setting policy, which then has to be instantiated, of course. So what if the question is what are the lingering effects for ethics owners, I'd say probably not that much. I actually think companies are more interested in investing in ethics owners than they are in ethics boards. The lingering effects in terms of the conversation around how companies should be investing in ethics in general as a category of activity. I think that it's probably scared off companies from doing much publicly, right? And that's unfortunate, in part because there are some idiosyncrasies around how Google went about it that cause more furor than it might have otherwise. For instance, not really getting input from their ethics owners, right? I mean, in some ways, that board was sunk by their employees who work on ethics issues, but were not consulted by their supervisors adequately, or by the VPs and presidents who pulled the board together. It might have gone very differently had the people closest to the conversations that ethics owners are having had actually been consulted more thoroughly about how to build the board and who to invite to be on it.
Do you want to add anything to that, Manny? Or
I don't know how I possibly could. That was very thorough.
All right. So there's interest in kind of the connection to engineering education and just this broader question of what kind of training did you find that ethics owners had going into their jobs, and maybe what kind do you think they should have?
I think that's a great question. The ethics owners we talked to had a broad range of disciplinary backgrounds, from very STEM, science education, engineering, political science. Some had degrees in philosophy. So a lot of them come from a diverse set of disciplinary backgrounds, and yet there is no training program for becoming an ethics owner, right? There's no concrete curricula. So I think for a lot of folks, where they came from disciplinarily shaped where they stood and what kind of practices they had available. In terms of like the broader conversation around ethics training in technology, there's often this move to treat ethics in college classes as a nice to have or as the last week in a semester. So I'm very encouraged by educational pedagogical moves to integrate ethics training directly in the same modules that treat standard engineering practices. So if you can find a way to treat the ethical implications of bubble sort at the same time that you're teaching a young engineer to do bubble sort, I think that's very encouraging. That said, for ethics owners themselves, I think there's much more discipline building that could be done and professionalization that could be done. And some of the work Jake has done with IEEE, I think, is a move in that direction, and other entities are working in that direction as well.
Great, thanks.
I would just add, there's some career trajectories that are common. So we find engineers who get really inspired by the ethics and politics of technology. So they have their own strong moral compass for whatever reason, and they feel an obligation to become involved in these conversations, and that's how they end up in governance roles. But we also see folks from social sciences, law, humanities, who have a strong interest in technology for their own reasons, end up getting hired into roles that are more closely located to like policy and law in the tech companies. And so I actually think it's beneficial to have that variety of trajectory. It should be expected, and it could be encouraged by educational institutions through lots of cross-training and lots of opportunities to have these conversations between people with different specialties.
And how did designers and user experience researchers fit into the category of ethics?
Design thinking has a really big role in the ethics space in tech companies. And so, UX and UI methods are actually really have a lot of overlap with ethics, the activity of ethics owners, because it's about imagining the user, right? And so there are some really useful techniques in design thinking around visualizing, understanding, mapping, making sense of what it is like to use this product. And so we see a genre of tools. Like a really great example of this would be the Omidyar Network's Ethical OS, right? So it's like a conversation sparking tool that essentially builds the muscles, like the ethics muscles of your team, because then you have to reason together, you have to talk, you have to be comfortable having these conversations. But the role of the ethics owner is much more oriented towards governance than imagination, right? So in some ways, the problem that ethics owners are grappling with is too much imagination. And so while design thinking inspires us to think about the user, what the ethics owner ultimately needs to do is to turn that into a governance method, not just an interesting conversation. So, I mean, I don't want to say UI and UX is about having interesting conversation, but the way that design thinking gets imported into ethics has to be followed through with familiar legal and technical governance mechanisms.
I would just add to that the UX community actually has some of the strongest muscle memory for understanding exactly how technology products affect users, and that can be a way of bringing the outside world inside of the decision-making centers of power, rather than getting a bunch of engineers together to just think really hard about how this might affect users. UX folks have robust methodologies and training into that world, or into the broader world.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to give the impression that I'm saying something negative about UI UX, but because some of the smartest people we know who have ethics owners roles come from that background. But it's a slightly different problem than ethics owners overall are trying to solve.
Tell us a little bit more about the levels of buy-in within these companies, both at the executive and peer level, and kind of how that reflected what the ethics owners' experiences were like within their companies.
It matters a lot. We heard often that no matter that the kinds of interventions an ethics owner might be able to make within their own ambit depends on the amount of buy-in they have from the C-suite or from the board. One of the other things we found that is related is the way in which the corporation is structured has a lot of influence over what kind of moves are available to ethics owners. So some folks sit really close to the legal team, and that gives them a certain degree of insight or flexibility or responsibility over things like end user license agreements and contractual forms of managing risk. Other ethics owners sat much closer to product teams, which give a different set of hooks into how the product is designed and developed and then rolled out for testing and monitoring. So the corporate hierarchy is set at the highest levels, and then how ethics owners are positioned within that set of responsibilities really matters for how they can do their work.
Thanks. Another question is, what is the role of providers of AI kind of algorithms, so open source, Google, in preventing the harmful consequences of apps developed within their tools?
That is a hard problem. We heard a lot from folks who work for like enterprise platforms about the challenge of not knowing how your product is going to be used, and worrying that that like the fundamental business relationship of an enterprise platform is often you allow your software to be instantiated on a company's own servers, so that they have access to their data and you don't, right? And so when it comes to controlling how your product gets used and avoiding the blowback that could come from like a really negative PR situation, there's the options boil down to contractual limits and education. And I think when it comes to those open source tools, there's an obligation for folks like Google to really proactively engage in that educational end. They don't have those contractual tools. Google's a great example. They've produced a lot of like core machine learning technology or technologies and open source them, and have really democratized this technology in a way that's really important and I think commendable. But then there needs to be with it some amount of like really proactive, purposeful education and training around how to avoid harms, how to like set metrics to avoid things like algorithmic bias, algorithmic unfairness, and make those tools equally usable and approachable as they have made the those core open source resources.
Thanks. The next question is, having ethics owners and committees seems to be the industry solution, but it's a solution that represents the companies. How can individuals in society provide their input?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as part of this research, we tried to also include the voices of activists and advocacy organizations and citizens themselves. And the power imbalance is stark. And so because this is very much my personal view, because the benefits of these technologies flow, the financial benefits of these technologies flow to the companies. That brings along with it a set of responsibilities for these companies to go out and try to raise these voices up, to listen to outside voices as much as they can, even when it's not necessarily in their best interest. That might not be a very satisfying suggestion, but there are also organizations that are outside of companies that are doing a great deal of work to raise the level of awareness of these issues, to put forward scholarship and policy proposals that have the ear of lawmakers, and some of those are very important. And hopefully we'll see more of that in the months and years to come.
I have a question of my own. So in your paper, you have this really great quote, right? You say, a closer examination of how ethics is becoming institutionalized as a set of roles and responsibilities and operationalized as a set of practices and procedures reveals the risk of a premature foreclosure of the fundamentally open-ended and irresolvable questions that underlie human value commitments. I want to ask, what are some questions that you fear might have been prematurely foreclosed? And do you see other parts of these companies absorbing responsibility for those issues, or are they sidelined?
So there are, I definitely want to hear what Jake has to say about this question as well. It's a great question. So there are some fairly expansive, fundamental questions that corporations shouldn't necessarily be in charge of solving, particularly through some sort of internal ethics process. So is it right that, or is it appropriate for public transportation agencies to be disinvested from because of the existence of a rideshare platform, right? That's a public good, the existence of which shouldn't be left up to a ride-sharing platform. Questions about the racial disparity of certain decisions being brought into balance along demographic categories. Perhaps the fundamental value there isn't balancing the demographic categories along which decisions are made, but a broader question about what the nature of the decision is. So if we're concerned about child protective services, paying more attention to children of African-American families versus children of white families, and having to make the decision about how to prioritize that kind of intervention, maybe the broader question is about the scarcity of support for families, broadly speaking. So those are the kinds of questions that get kind of institutionalized as perhaps one rung down the ladder of concern to the level that's tractable within companies building algorithms.
Yeah, it's a great problem. We spend a lot of time going back and forth on, and that's in part because some of the critics of the tech industry have really great critiques of the power of tech companies. That tech companies are ill-suited to solve themselves, right? And so we have this language of moral justice that is really powerful, and I think typically very accurate about the consequences of tech companies having consolidated all this power in our society. But the solution to that isn't giving them more power over those decisions. And I think ethics owners are actually an important middle ground there, because we're never going to solve questions of algorithmic fairness without ethics owners doing governance, right? But it shouldn't be the companies that set the standards for fairness, right? So there's this push and pull where we need the language of moral justice. We need democratic governance. We need society to have an articulated a much more clearly articulated vision of what we want from our technology. But we don't want companies deciding that for us. But when we do decide it, we need companies to instantiate it, right? And that's what we sort of see as the role of ethics owners, is translating between that like broader societal pressure and then the actual like kind of boring, mundane techniques of corporate governance that actually fill their sort of daily practice. And that's like a big challenge, right? That's a really significant organizational lift to do that. It's hard. And so one way that we can help is to like, get our heads on straight about what we actually want to demand from tech companies, and to like actually have institutions that are able to functionally articulate that. That's my hot take.
Okay. Well, I have two more questions for you.
Great.
So in your paper, you say only once a company is confident of its long-term viability might it begin discussing ethics, evidenced by the relative maturity and success of the companies just now investing in formal ethics governance. Someone in the audience pointed out your examples were primarily around larger, more established companies. And I think in the article you say that you looked at companies with over 1,000 employees, but what about addressing ethical issues in smaller emerging organizations? Have you seen examples, maybe since you put out the paper, of some of these companies trying to use that language or hire ethics owners?
Yes, definitely. There's definitely an emerging conversation about these roles in startups.
Okay.
Startups have the challenge of everybody does a little bit of everything, or maybe the CEO does all of everything. And so ethics owners as a distinct role within a startup is maybe not going to be very common, right? Like they're going to invest in engineers and data scientists first. And there's a conversation that's ongoing about like, when do you add this capacity, or when does it even make sense to add this kind of capacity? But it's not to say that ethics aren't a live issue for startups. It's just that the organizational role that we're describing might not actually have a foothold in a startup. Now, a lot of startups are going to have those folks on that career trajectory where they're engineers who are really passionate about the ethical, social, political consequences of technology. And those people should be encouraged and facilitated to take on that role within the company. But they're probably not going to be guided by someone with the distinct organizational role that we're describing until the company has achieved a certain level of maturity to be able to like handle that particular role, right? Where you need that organizational translator.
Thanks. This is the last question. So people within the audience have kind of phrased this in different ways, but can you suggest better ways of doing ethics? And there's this question around, is it really something that government regulation will ultimately have to help with? I mean, you've suggested quite a few things throughout the talk, but your concluding thoughts on like, what is a better way of doing this?
Government regulation helps set the standards to which the ethics owners need to point the company, right? So government is not going to regulations and governmental action or regulatory action is not going to solve the problem of ethics in tech companies. What the government should be trying to do is to mandate due diligence practices, right? It should be setting expectations for auditing. It should be requiring companies that use automated decision systems to articulate a model of bias prevention or a certain notion of fairness, and allow companies to show their own work rather than be rather than the government specifying exactly what the company should be doing, right? So in that case, the role of the ethics owner becomes that much more important because they have to coordinate the activity across the company to show the work and achieve the due diligence. Then it becomes a lot easier for us as a society to ask those deeper questions, right? It's very hard to ask questions about algorithmic fairness if companies aren't even measuring what their models are doing, right? So like there's really basic governance questions that have to be resolved in order to even like move to that next step where we can ask the higher order question. And it's that dynamic that I think we need to learn how to be better at.
Great. If you don't have anything to add to that, Manny.
I'll just co-sign that. I know we're
okay, great. Well, thank you both so much. Thanks to the organizers, the speakers, and the participants in today's HI seminar. We'll be back next week with new speakers. And please, I encourage you in the chat to check out some of the sources Jake sent that are really interesting. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.